The calendar had turned to 1888, but winter held the American prairie in a merciless grip. It was a season that would be etched in memory, not just for its biting winds and relentless snow, but for the chilling silence it imposed upon the land. In one small, God-fearing settlement on that frontier, life was dictated by two unyielding forces. The brutal, frostbitten air that stole the breath from your lungs, and the rigid piety of a community that saw judgment in every shadow. For a young woman like Grace Hamilton, the burden of their virtue was a cross heavier than she could bear. She toiled in her father's trading post, a simple structure of timber and sod that served as the town's very pulse. Its shelves offered the staples of existence, sacks of grain that smelled of the earth, woolen blankets to ward off the unforgiving cold, forged steel for mending fences and breaking ground, and whiskey. It was that final offering, stored in dark glass bottles, that brewed a quiet storm of disapproval around Grace. The whispers followed her like her own shadow as she measured out flour or folded a new blanket. A woman of good standing, they'd murmur behind cupped hands, has no business pouring spirits for men. Their piety was a sharper cold than the wind outside. The heart of this trouble was the saloon, a dim and rowdy annex tucked away at the rear of the post. It was a place for men with calloused hands and weathered souls, a place that smelled of stale beer and damp wool. Though Grace kept her distance, its very existence cast a long, dark stain upon her reputation. In a town this small, perception was truth. And every sideways look was a verdict, every hushed comment a nail in the coffin of her good name. That evening, as the wind began to howl its mournful song against the shutters, Grace moved through the aisles like a ghost. She straightened goods that were already straight, her mind a whirlwind of unspoken frustrations. The fire in the hearth burned bright, but its warmth couldn't reach the chill that had settled deep within her bones. From the saloon, a coarse laugh suddenly erupted, cutting through the low hum of the post. It was followed by a man's slurred voice, loud enough to be heard through the thin wooden wall. "That Hamilton girl. She's got a quiet look, but I reckon still waters run deep, if you catch my meaning." Another burst of laughter followed. Grace froze. Her hands clenched around a bolt of cotton, her knuckles white. She had heard variations of that sentiment 1,000 times. But tonight, in the desolate howl of the storm, the words weren't just whispers. They were shackles. She looked toward the snow-swept darkness outside the window. Her destination was a mystery, a blank space on the map of her life. But the starting point was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. She had to escape. Not just the town, but the life that was slowly suffocating her. She didn't wait for a second thought, for reason to catch up to the raw, desperate need for flight. Pulling her thin cloak tighter, a meager shield against the storm's fury, she slipped out of the trading post and into the white chaos of the night. Each step was a plunge into a bottomless sea of white. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair across her face and stealing the air from her lungs. Soon, the faint, warm glow of the town's windows was gone, swallowed by the churning vortex of snow. The world dissolved into a featureless, roaring expanse, and a cold tendril of fear, sharper than any frost, began to curl in her stomach. She spun around, desperate to find her own trail, but the wind, like a spiteful spirit, had already wiped the slate clean. There was no going back. There was only the storm. Without warning, the solid ground betrayed her. A sheet of ice, hidden beneath a fresh dusting of snow, gave way with a sickening crack. Her feet shot out from under her, and she crashed down with a cry that the wind instantly stole from her lips. A searing pain shot up from her ankle. She struggled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Every attempt to move, every shift of her weight, was a fresh wave of agony. The cold began to seep past her clothes, a deep and relentless chill that settled into her very bones. For a time she pushed on, driven by sheer will, as if the storm itself was mocking her foolish courage. Finally, her body could give no more. Her legs buckled, and she sank into the deep, cold embrace of a snowdrift. The howling of the wind was the last thing she knew, as darkness claimed her. Miles away, in a cabin that was little more than a fortress against the wilderness, Caleb Mason added another log to his fire, listening to the gale rage against his sturdy walls. And that's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A thin, desperate thread of a voice, woven into the fabric of the storm. He paused, head cocked, dismissing it as a trick of the wind, a phantom cry created by the groaning timbers of his home. But then it came again. It was clearer this time, sharper, piercing through the roar with the unmistakable edge of true desperation. It was a sound no man of conscience could ignore. Without a second thought, Caleb pulled on his heavy coat, took up the flickering light of his lantern, and opened his door to the raging blizzard. The blizzard fought him with the fury of a living beast. He pushed into the teeth of the wind, a solitary figure against an endless canvas of white, his lantern casting a small, defiant circle of light. He followed the memory of the sound, a desperate hope against the roaring gale. And then, the feeble glow caught something. A dark shape against the snow. A human form, nearly buried, still as death. He fell to his knees beside the shape, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Snow clung to her hair like a death shroud. Her skin was the color of porcelain, her lips a faint, chilling blue. But a wisp of breath, fragile as a ghost, escaped them. She was alive. He gathered her into his arms, a weight that was both fragile and immense. The journey back was a battle for every inch, his boots searching for purchase on the treacherous ice beneath the powder. The wind clawed at him, trying to reclaim its prize, but he shielded her with his own body and did not stop. Inside the cabin, he laid her on a pallet of furs before the hearth. He worked with a quiet urgency, peeling away her frozen clothes and cocooning her in heavy wool blankets. He spent the long hours of the night as a sentinel, feeding the fire, rubbing the life back into her frozen hands, and patiently coaxing droplets of warm water past her lips. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the single window, her eyelids trembled. And then, slowly, they opened. Consciousness returned not with a jolt, but as a slow tide of sensation. First, there was warmth. A deep, penetrating warmth she thought she'd never feel again. Then a scent, of wood smoke and pine. Her gaze settled on a man sitting in a chair nearby. He was built of broad shoulders and quiet strength, his face a landscape carved by solitude and harsh seasons. His eyes watched her, holding no judgment, but no welcome either. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "My cabin," he answered, his voice low and steady. "You're lucky I found you." The words, the sight of him, the unfamiliar walls. It all came rushing back. The flight, the fall, the storm. She was alone, in a strange man's cabin, far from town. The implications of it washed over her, a chill far colder than the snow. Her reputation would be in ashes. I must go," she stammered, trying to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back. He simply shook his head, his voice as firm as the timber of the cabin walls. "The storm hasn't passed. To leave now is to die." A heavy silence fell between them, thick with unspoken fears and the howling of the wind outside. Grace closed her eyes, a prisoner not just of the storm, but of the kindness that had saved her life only to ruin it. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, Caleb watched her. He, too, had once known the confines of a town. He'd had a family, a future, until fire had stolen it all, leaving him with nothing but ash and the deep, abiding silence of the wilderness. He had chosen this solitude. He had cultivated it. But now, with the stranger sleeping by his fire, the silence felt different. Less like peace, and more like loneliness. And he found, to his own surprise, that a part of him dreaded the inevitable quiet that would follow her departure. The world outside the cabin finally fell silent. The wind's rage was spent, leaving behind a landscape of breathtaking, unbroken white under a sky the color of pale steel. The storm was over. When Grace was strong enough to stand, Caleb prepared to take her back. He would see her home. It was not a question, but a quiet statement of fact. His rifle was slung over his shoulder as they stepped out into the bright, cold morning. But as they entered the town, a new kind of storm began to brew. A storm of hushed words and sideways glances, a current of gossip that passed from one set of eyes to the next. The silence here was not peaceful. It was heavy, and it was filled with judgment. The words, spoken just loud enough to be heard, were like stones cast in a quiet pond. With him. Alone. Her father stood behind the main counter of the trading post. His face was a mask of disbelief that hardened into a pale, tight-lipped fury as the murmurs reached him. His voice was a low tremor, barely controlled. "Daughter, do you comprehend the ruin you have brought to this door?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. The truth felt useless here. Then, his eyes fell upon the stranger at her side, the mountain man who was the source of this disgrace. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "What sort of man allows a decent woman to come to this?" Caleb's expression remained unchanged, as still and solid as the winter earth. His reply was quiet, yet it silenced the entire room. The kind that didn't let her die. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of that simple, undeniable truth. Grace could feel every eye on her, every mind-passing sentence. Her father let out a long, shuddering breath, the fight draining from him, replaced by grim resignation. He looked from his daughter to the stranger, and delivered his verdict. "There is only one path back from this. You will marry." The words struck Grace with the force of a physical blow. Her heart sank, a leaden weight in her chest. This was not a proposal. It was a sentence. Caleb's gaze found hers, steady and clear. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment. Only a quiet resolve. "To preserve your honor," he said, his voice meant for her alone. "It will be done." Their union was sealed not with celebration, but with a somber ceremony in the small, cold church at the edge of town. The few who gathered in the pews were not witnesses to joy, but spectators to a scandal's resolution. Grace wore a dress loaned to her out of pity, its seam straining slightly at her shoulders. He stood beside her, looking constrained and out of place in a suit that belonged to another time. But when he took her hand to repeat the vows, his touch was unexpectedly firm and steady. In the brief moment their eyes met, she saw none of the resentment she expected. She saw only a quiet gravity, and something that looked like respect. It was a small, fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The first weeks in the cabin were a careful dance of avoidance, measured by the vast, unspoken space between them. He spent his days in the forest, hunting or chopping wood. She tended to the small cabin, bringing a semblance of order to the wildness, her silence a constant companion. Their lives ran on parallel tracks that rarely seemed to cross. Then one evening, by the low light of the fire, the silence was finally broken. He spoke of a different life, of a family lost to flame and smoke, a grief so profound it had driven him into the wilderness to escape its ghost. Grace listened, her heart aching not with pity, but with a sudden, profound understanding of the solitude in his soul. Their fragile peace was soon tested. A new storm came, not of snow, but of ice, encasing the world in glass and battering their small shelter with its punishing weight. A heavy branch, burdened with ice, cracked the roof above them. In the biting cold, they worked as one, he on the roof, she below, passing up tools and timbers, their hands raw, their breaths pluming in the frigid air. The sheer exhaustion and the bitterness of her fate finally boiled over. "I never wanted this life," she cried out, her voice sharp with unshed tears, the words torn from her by the wind. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, his own weariness etched onto his face. His reply was not angry, but quiet and heavy with truth. "Nor did I." That night, the silence that fell between them by the fire was different. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a shared quiet. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who had faced a trial together, and had not been broken. Something unspoken had shifted. The walls between them had begun to fall. The first true test of their new partnership came not from ice or wind, but from the hunger of the wild. As Grace gathered firewood at the edge of the clearing, a sound froze the air. A low rumble that came from the throat of a predator. From the shadows of the pines, a wolf emerged, its yellow eyes fixed on her. Then another, and another. Her scream was sharp and sudden. The cabin door burst open. Caleb was there, rifle already at his shoulder. His voice was a sharp command that cut through her fear. "To me, Grace. Now." She ran, not looking back, until she was safely behind him. A single shot cracked through the quiet air, a warning that echoed through the trees. The wolves hesitated, then melted back into the forest. He lowered the rifle as they vanished. "The winter has been long," he said, more to himself than to her. "It makes all creatures desperate for survival." He looked at her then, his gaze firm but gentle. "Stay closer to the cabin." It was not a command, but a quiet plea. As the days grew longer, the iron grip of winter began to fail. Patches of dark, rich earth appeared from beneath the snow. And Grace realized the cabin no longer felt like a shelter, or a cage. It felt like a beginning. It felt like home. She tilled a small patch of soil near the fence line, coaxing life from the awakening ground. He worked nearby, mending the fence, the simple sounds of their labors weaving together into a peaceful, domestic rhythm. The silence between them was now a language of its own, rich with comfort and understanding. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of fire and rose, he wordlessly pressed a small object into her hand. It was a carving, whittled from a piece of pine, rough-hewn and imperfect, but unmistakably the figures of a man and a woman, standing together. "It is us," he said, his voice quiet. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the simple lines with her finger. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you." He reached out, his calloused hand gently covering hers as it held the carving. "You have a strength you do not see in yourself, Grace." A warmth bloomed in her chest, chasing away the last of the winter's chill. For the first time in her memory, she felt more than just safe. She felt seen. Beneath a blanket of stars, brighter and clearer than any she had known in town, they stood together in the quiet of their shared world. Their journey had begun in a storm of snow and judgment. But it had led them here. Home.